let's start with Twitter because we saw, miss on the top line, users in line. Dan, is Twitter just treading water right now?
I think Twitter's basically trading right now as odds or almost an arbitrage on what's going to happen in Delaware. In terms of with the Musk deal, in terms of how that plays out from either a settlement or he ultimately needs to, buy Twitter based on the Delaware court. But I will tell you, those metrics firmer than feared, and I think it shows, especially when you compare it, as Ed talked about, the snap, just absolute disaster, blaming everything except for the wind. I mean, Twitter holding it a bit better than expected, but it is trading right now on what's happening in terms of October in the Delaware court case.
And remember, it was Snap, coming out and revising its forecast earlier this year that sort of kickstarted this market meltdown. David, what's your take on what we're seeing from Snap? Even Evan Spiegel himself saying he's not happy with these results.
Well, I think in the digital advertising business, some companies are a lot better positioned than others. And Snap is not at the center of the industry. I think it is at risk, and it showed that it's at risk of unusually strong reaction when advertisers start to pull back. I don't think that's the case for some of the bigger companies. It is interesting to me when you look at what's happening with Twitter. It's a company that probably has gained a lot from the sheer publicity around the Musk efforts, and they are gaining users. So I agree with Dan, it's not nearly as bad as we might have expected.
So here's the question, Dan, how much does what's happening with Snap and what we just saw with Twitter signal about the state of the online ad business? What does this actually mean for Meta or Alphabet, for example? Dan?
Yeah, and there's obviously a big drum roll into next week. I think one of the most pivotal week of earnings for tech in probably 5-6 years. But look, Snap, even a good economy, Snap's had a lot of difficulty getting their arms around their business. Continuum is viewed as a paper airplane and a hurricane. I still believe when it comes to YouTube in terms of Google and what we're going to see, even Pinterest and others, I think digital ads slowing, but I think maybe holding up a bit better than feared. But that's why next week's going to be key, especially when it comes to Meta. Street's baking in a lot of bad news. But I just continue to not view Snap as the best barometer for what's happening in the industry.
That said, there's a lot of talk now about whether the social media business model is sputtering, is on the verge of failing. I mean, David, we're seeing Facebook, pivot entirely to a whole new future with Meta, in part because I'm sure because of some of the weaknesses that they see internally. I mean, do you think this is some sort of what we've seen so far, whether it's just the last couple of weeks or the last, couple of quarters, a sort of indictment on the business model of social media?
No, I don't. In fact, I think the pivot to Meta and the metaverse at what used to be called Facebook really has a lot of other causes, and a lot of them have to do with reputational management. I don't think the social media industry is at risk of failing in any fundamental way. I think the evolution is happening faster than some would have expected, particularly with TikTok's extraordinary billion global user rise. The incumbents aren't really prepared. They aren't as fleet-footed now, especially as they're so big, particularly in the case of Facebook and Google to a lesser extent. I think Google is the best positioned company of all of these, though, myself.
So you think Google has the biggest upside in the tech sector? Why?
Well, it's not that it has. It's just that its embeddedness in the global economy, not the tech economy, just in the global economy is so thorough, so immovable. This is not true for the businesses of Meta, Facebook, except for possibly WhatsApp, which is a business that really does have a almost impregnable global position. But the Google services, many of them are just inconceivable for people to live without. And I think that is a huge defense mechanism for them. They've put themselves in a fantastic position over decades of building incredibly well-designed and useful businesses.
Dan, what tech company do you think has the biggest upside right now?
Well, first, I agree 100% with David on the Google side going into next week. But to me, it's that company in Cupertino. It's Apple, because I think That's one, it's an underestimated demand cycle still, even with a swirling macro in terms of iPhone 14. You got a quarter of the base, about 225 million, that have not upgraded in 3.5 years. That services business, Rock of Gibraltar, and I think that's going to come through next week. And I think some of the parts, Apple's still a stock that has a 2 in front of it. That continues to be our top tech name.
But Dan, even Apple is cutting back on hiring, cutting back on costs, cutting back on spending for various divisions. What does that tell you?
Look, I think that they're being prudent. You're seeing that across the valley from Microsoft to Amazon to others. But this is more prudence rather than what I sort of view as just a massive deceleration that's happened in the business. And I think there's also other areas that they're looking to spend on. And it comes down to what's baked into these stocks. I think that's a theme that we saw play out with Netflix, with Tesla. And I think next week, I view this as sort of better than feared in terms of how it's going to play out in Apple. I continue to put an asterisk around that front and center, along with Microsoft being our core cloud name.
David, would you say you're expecting better than feared results next week?
I think it's hard to predict what's going to happen next week. But one thing that I would say, it was on a Bloomberg article this week that I read that a recession is almost inevitable if it hasn't started already. So any of these companies that were not preparing themselves by battening down the hatches would be pretty poorly managed. I do agree. Apple has just done another job, sort of like Google, in its own unique way of building businesses that just can't be stopped. So I doubt if they would be slowed much by even the beginnings of a recession.